Well, all right, guys. I don't know if this is bad news, good news. It's intense news, these heated conversations. Let's bring in a little levity, a little storytelling, a little side hustle. Longtime Tenean, Michael McClellan, is with us, joined nearly by, I think, in close proximity, Adam Laxalt, who was with us a few weeks ago. Michael has the side hustle of all side hustles. I'm sort of like, hey, what's your side hustle? I'm like, well, I was working on an above ground garden here in Austin, Texas. I made about a month in, all the vegetables are dead. I'm like, Michael, what's your side hustle? He's like, well, I wrote a 750-page book that Stephen Pressfield writes this. Wait for it. If Michael McClellan had lived a century earlier on the other side of the Atlantic, I have no doubt he would have joined J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis in Oxford's Inklings Club, building enchanted worlds out of history and imagination. Michael, one hell of a side hustle. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Evan. Honored to be here. And Stephen Pressfield is clearly way too kind and generous.
Well, we described it as a side hustle. It's been a topic actually at a number of Teneo retreats over time. Many Teneans have a dream. They say, I'd love to write a book, but oh gosh, I'd never have time for it. Before we get into the narrative and the story of what's actually in the book, how did you pull this off?
Well, it started in about 2008, and like many people that are trying to write a book with a family and a demanding full-time job, I'm a partner in a law firm. I was a weekend warrior, and so I would write, maybe 1,000 words or maybe even a couple thousand words in a weekend, and then I would go into the work week. And I would try and pick it up the next weekend, and often I would lose the thread. And so I would end up rewriting chapters over and over and over, aiming for perfection, but I wouldn't have that forward momentum that you really need if you want to do something very long. So we had a death in the family in January of 2014, and that had the effect of sort of jarring me in reminding me that life is not a dress rehearsal. And so I started writing 500 words a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And in the early years, based on where I was at in the law career, that was at 5:05 a.m. every day. And that was the way. And for me, I realized it sort of was like the pain of doing that was outweighed by the fear of falling off the wagon.
Mm. Well, this is no side hustle project. I think it's 700 plus pages, called the Sea Sand. Sorry, I can't even read. The Sand Sea. It is
That's right.
It's a fantasy fiction series set in the 1880s. You obviously won't give away the whole story, but give us some contours. What is the narrative in this book? What's sort of the core story you're telling in the book?
Sure. So I grew up reading a ton of history, and my favorite era was the clash of civilizations of the first era of globalization, which is basically from the end of the American Civil War to the beginning of the First World War. And I wanted to tell a story that sort of emulated some of the books that had captured me as a kid the most, the ones that kept me up reading late, like Lord of the Rings. But I wanted to tell it in that age of steam because I had never read that book. That book didn't exist as far as I knew. There was steampunk and other stuff, but sort of a Game of Thrones scope epic that was set in that age. And so the fundamental premise of the story is that you have some Western powers. Some are, and mine is a world that mirrors the Gilded Age and the peak of the British Empire. So you have some New Anglians, which is sort of the Republic, and then you have some Anglians, which is the Imperium. And there's this resource that is in this eastern desert called the Sand Sea. And these fathers that are sort of oligarchs, they think they're sending their kids with these others to make a deal so they can get this special resource. What they don't know is that they're sending their kids into the Sand Sea in the year of the Bessarian prophecy, when a promised one of the West and the East are supposed to arise to overthrow the dynasty that's been ruling for 800 years. And so these Westerners find themselves having much more than they bargained for.
Mm. Well, just in your own spare time and reading of all this stuff, also crafting your own story, it does seem like many narratives that emerge, well, shoot, always, but even in times of crisis, narratives out of Hollywood, narratives from our great fiction writers feel and seem to be very dystopian, to undermine the fabric of this nation, to introduce great skepticism and distrust in leaders, and at the end of the day, to paint a pessimistic picture that life in front of us will be worse than it was behind us. Do you agree with that? And how does your narrative fit into that?
I think that's a really interesting question, Evan. And if you think about it, Game of Thrones is fairly, and I'm thinking out loud here, so I may get myself in trouble, but Game of Thrones is a pretty skeptical series, right? It's pretty skeptical about human nature. And that was largely written, I think he wrote Game of Thrones book one, I think was in the mid 1990s. And so if you think about that, was a very optimistic age. The Berlin Wall had fallen, the Cold War was over. And so I think they may actually be inversely related. Tolkien, of course, wrote Lord of the Rings in the midst of World War II, and it was largely infused based upon his experiences in the trenches in the First World War. So I think potentially that works of optimism can emerge from periods of chaos. And as I listen to, obviously, to some of the things that Heather and Jonathan were talking about, we're living in heavy times. And I think potentially a sense that there is dawn to come, that there is light that will emerge, I think is something that we're all searching for and seek right now. And there is intense darkness in the Sand Sea, and there are phenomenal travails that our characters encounter on their hero's journey. But it ultimately, at the end, is actually also a book of profound optimism, that there is light at the end of the tunnel.
I know you've gotten to know and become a mentee under Stephen Pressfield. Two fantastic books. Gates of Fire was first given to me by Sean Clifford, fabulous book, and then The War of Art, which I've read and given away as a gift. I have to say, your side hustle, an hour in the morning thing, doesn't seem to be exactly what he's calling for in The War of Art. I would think the proper War of Art disciple is like all in, but somehow you pulled off a great thing that he loves without following his advice?
Well, that's interesting. I think Steve likes my 500 a day. Look,
okay.
my inspiration was I knew I had a family, had to pay the mortgage, et cetera, and had a growing practice. But I also I came across something. I don't even remember where I first saw it, but Anthony Trollope, the very famous Victorian novelist. I think he was the second highest bestseller in that era after Charles Dickens. Winston Churchill was a huge fan of Trollope novels. Trollope woke up and wrote 2,500 words every morning before he went to his job at the General Post Office, which in Victorian England was a big deal. So I think the one thing that Steve talks about, Pressfield, and everybody else that talks about the discipline of creating art is consistency. You have to have consistency, and you take the time that you can take, and you just have to string them together one after the other after the other. And I think we all tend to overestimate what we can do in a year or in a month or in 6 months. But I think we also tend to underestimate what we can do in 5 or 10 years, which is a lot. If you do something every day for 5 or 10 years, you can do big things.
Yeah. Well, practically speaking, we're super excited to be buyers of your book. How can they buy it, and how can people be helpful to this being a successful launch?
Well, Evan, thank you. Look, we went live on Amazon yesterday. Our first little batch of hardcovers sold out. I know there's another big batch sitting in an Amazon warehouse that's waiting to go back into inventory. So hopefully that'll be up later this afternoon or tomorrow. But the Kindle is also available on Amazon. And look, I mean, if people read it and like it, spread the word. That's the best thing. Refer it to a friend or a spouse or a family member or whoever.